Good evening. If you'll turn to Acts chapter 17, we're going to start there. Spend some time studying an account there we find in Acts chapter 17. As you turn over there, it's good to see everybody tonight. Hopefully we'll have something that'll be helpful to all of us to think about. Brother Yu didn't know it, but he gave a pretty good introduction to this lesson when he spoke on Sunday morning, so I appreciate him doing that without knowing it. He spoke about a story that we find in Acts chapter 16, kind of just before this account that we're going to talk about tonight, but it really sets the stage and gives some background about the environment and what's going on at that time. You know, he talks about Paul and Silas and how they had been cast into prison, how they had sang praises and prayed to God, and how the jailer had kind of seen and heard that, and eventually the earthquake came, and their bands were loose and they could have escaped, and they stayed there and kept the jailer from harming himself. And as we know, eventually sat down and talked to them after he came to them and said, "What must I do to be saved?" Very important question. He talked to him and his family, and eventually they were baptized. And so that was part of the lesson, and appreciate him sharing that. But we'll talk about what kind of happens after that as we look into this story in Acts chapter 17. But that's kind of the environment that they were in. They'd been thrown into prison, and here as you get to the end of Acts chapter 16, they're able to leave Philippi and they're traveling. And so we pick that up here in the beginning part of Acts chapter 17. And we'll look at this story and then look at one of the characters here tonight and think about maybe some of the things that we can get from studying that. So in Acts chapter 17 and verse 1, we'll start there. And it says, now when they, of course it's talking about Paul and Silas here, it says, "Now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul, as his manner was, went in unto them, and 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them out of the Scriptures." And so here they've traveled, they've left Philippi, and now they're at Thessalonica. They've gone to a synagogue, and it says that's kind of typical for what Paul would have done, as it says here, as the manner of his was. So that was something he typically did. We'll see that again. He was discussing or reasoning from the Scriptures, so they were looking at the Old Testament and talking through that. And you might ask, well, what did they talk about? And you can kind of see that as we continue on in verse 3. It says there in verse 3, it says, "Opening and alleging that Christ must needs have suffered and risen again from the dead, and that this Jesus whom I preach unto you is Christ." And so they were looking at the Scriptures and looking at likely the prophecies that had been told about this coming Messiah and Christ that would come eventually. And he's alleging or making an argument that here he was. He came. Jesus was that Messiah that they were looking for. He's come. He's lived. He's died, and he's risen from the grave. And so that's the argument. That's what he's talking to them about, is this Messiah that has come, and it's Jesus. In verse 4 it says, "And some of them believed and consorted with Paul and Silas, and of the devout Greeks a great multitude, and of the chief women not a few." And so we can see that many of them anyway, believed what was being taught and could see the connection, I'm sure, between the prophecies and Jesus Christ. And it says they consorted with Paul and Silas. That word, I was like, what is consorted? What exactly is that? But it's really they sided with Paul and Silas. They were attached to, if you will, to Paul and Silas. So they were siding with what they were preaching and what they were talking to them about. So many of them, as it says here, believed. But it says in verse 5, "But the Jews which believed not, moved with envy, took unto them certain lewd fellows of a baser sort, and gathered a company, and set all the city on an uproar, and assaulted the house of Jason, and sought to bring them out to the people." And so we can see here in verse 5, there were some that didn't believe. They didn't attach themselves or follow along with what Paul and Silas were preaching there. They were jealous, and they gathered a group. It says, lewd fellows of the baser sort. So, what does that mean? From what I can tell, it's, vile or wicked people from a marketplace likely. But basically, they gathered this crowd. They created this, think of it as a mob, right? He's got this mob, right? And they're going to go attack or go to the assault, if you will, Jason's house. And the idea there was to bring Paul and Silas out of Jason's house and before the people. And so we'll see a little bit of this later, but clearly Paul and Silas are staying with Jason and staying in his house. And so that's why they've gone to his house. And we see in verse 6 that they didn't find Paul and Silas there, but in verse 6 it says, and when they found them not, again, they didn't find Paul and Silas at Jason's house at the time, they drew Jason and certain brethren unto the rulers of the city, crying, these that have turned the world upside down are come hither also. And here we see, think about where they're at. They're in this Greek city. It's likely has its own kind of rules and laws as they're ruled there by that particular city. And so when they talk about the rulers, it's likely the judges or magistrates that kind of rule over that particular city. And so they're looking to bring them out before the rulers. And they talk about this idea of they've turned the world upside down, and it's causing chaos basically amongst that area. They're disturbing the peace, if you will. They're teaching things that aren't something that they want necessarily taught there. And so they're as it says here, turning the world upside down and kind of separating and teaching something that's different than what they want to the people to follow, as far as like the Roman law and that sort of thing that's in place. In verse 7 it says, whom Jason hath received. So it's kind of saying Jason had received them, he had received them into his house. And it says, whom Jason hath received, and these all do contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, one Jesus. So again, he had received them as a guest, and really the insinuation here for Jason is, he's giving a place to stay for these guys that are causing trouble. He's kind of being lumped in with them, if you will. And the problem is, one of the problems is they're talking about this Jesus, and that's trumping the Caesar that's in place, and that's not a story. That's not a something that they want taught there. And in verse 8 it says, and they troubled the people and the rulers of the city when they heard these things. When they had taken security of Jason and of the other, they let them go. And so they had brought Jason out of his house, and others, as it says here, and so that's who they're referring to here, it seems. And they, as it says here, they had taken security of Jason. I was like, what does that mean exactly? But basically he had paid a bond, if you want to think about it, or a payment to be released. And so that's what that's referring to, and that's what he was required to do to kind of get out of this situation and be released. And then in verse 10 it says, and the brethren immediately sent away Paul and Silas by night unto Berea, who coming thither went into the synagogue of the Jews. And so given the turmoil and the situation, they sent Paul and Silas away. They said, go, and they did it during the night. Obviously, I think they're trying to make sure that they're not noticed as they're leaving, and it says they sent them away to Berea in this case. In verse 11 it says, these, and this is a familiar verse we read a lot, as they've left Thessalonica and gone to Berea, and it says, these were more noble than those in Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all readiness of mind, and searched the scriptures daily whether those things were so. Therefore many of them believed, also of honorable women, which were Greeks, and of men, not a few. And so we can see he's now left and gone to another place and kind of doing the same thing, if you will, as they've got others that are believing. And so if you kind of look at the current situation, the climate of what's going on, it's not surprising in the early days of the church that you've got Paul and Silas, going back to chapter 16, thrown in prison. They've escaped Philippi after that. They've gone to Thessalonica. Here's this riot, basically, where they're trying to go find them, and they've got a mob of some sort, looking for them. They escape out of that situation at night. They go again to Berea, and they keep preaching again in each place that they're at. And so there's conflict, I guess, if you will, between religiously with the Jews that don't agree. Some of them don't agree with what's been teaching. The government point of view, there's people that don't like what's being taught. If you think about the Roman government and their conflict, as it says here, with Caesar. And so there's a couple of different ways they're being attacked, persecuted, whatever you want to say, from a religious and from a government point of view. And yet you can see every place they went, they kept on going. They kept teaching those that they were coming into contact with. And so that's kind of the story here that we find. And I want to spend the rest of the time talking a little bit about Jason. kind of a minor character, if you will, in this particular story and the whole of the Bible, but maybe some things that we can get from what he did in this particular story for the rest of our time this evening. Like I said, seems like a minor character, but I think plays some important roles as we can look at tonight. You know, he's not someone we know a whole lot about. He's mentioned another time in the Bible in Romans chapter 16 and verse 21, as Paul is mentioning several people there in Romans chapter 21. He's listed there. It's thought to be the same Jason. It says, Timotheus, my work fellow, and Lucius and Jason and Sosipater, my kinsmen, salute you. Many times they have this salutation during his writings, and so Jason is one of those that is mentioned here in Romans, and like I say, it's thought to be the same Jason. That doesn't add a whole lot of context to what he's done or anything like that, but he is mentioned again. But from this story in Acts chapter 17, we can see a couple of things I think that we can take and maybe be encouraged by and use in our lives. Now, the first thing was he was hospitable. You know, he received them into his house. He let them live and stay with him while they were there in that city. And so he opened his home to Paul and Silas and provided them a place to stay. And that wasn't without some risk, as we can see. You know, people came to his house and drug him out of it. So that wasn't without some risk, considering the controversial, if you will, message that Paul and Silas were sharing with others. In Romans chapter 12, if you want to turn there, Romans chapter 12, I'll go ahead and start in verse 10, where it says, be kindly affectioned one to another with brotherly love, and honor, preferring one another, not slothful in business, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, continuing in instant in prayer, distributing to the necessity of the saints, given to hospitality. And so you can think about Jason. He was one that was obviously given to hospitality and let these folks come in and stay with him. In Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 2, Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 2 says, there, be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. So again, we need to be hospitable. Jason did that. He offered a place for them to stay. He might have thought, no, this is no big deal, but you can see it was an important thing that happened that enabled them to travel from place to place. You know, even in the face of risk, he opened his home to these men. You know, without people like this, you know, it might have made Paul and others travel and going and spreading the gospel a lot more difficult without people that were helping them. And maybe it seems like a small thing. Oh yeah, I'm just letting someone stay at my house for a day or two. But that could be really a big thing if you think about it and you look at this story in particular. And so we need to be willing to sacrifice, be willing to show hospitality towards others. But even more than that, you know, be willing to do maybe the small things that we don't think about, and it doesn't maybe seem a big deal, but maybe sacrificing our time is required sometimes. Maybe it's sacrificing or giving in financial support in some way in order to help the gospel be spread. And, you know, Jason wasn't the main character there. We don't always have to be, you know, doing some grand, great, big thing, and he wasn't probably thinking he did some great, grand, big thing either, but he played an important role, and we can all play a role no matter what we think it is. You know, all of us can do something different. All of us have different talents, but we need to play a role, whatever it is, and making sure the gospel gets to those that are around us. And so I think that's one thing that we can be encouraged by and think about that Jason did and we can do in our own lives. You know, he was also willing to pay the price, if you will. You know, there was a cost, and there is a cost to be a disciple of Christ. And this story highlights that. You know, when the mob couldn't find Paul and Silas, they drug him out, and there was potentially a cost to pay by, you know, harboring or letting these people stay with him. You know, this could have ended much worse, honestly, for Jason, and it ended much worse for many Christians at this time. You know, he was kind of let go back to doing his thing, right? But many others in that time, you know, endured much worse, even to death. But we need to be willing to pay the price to be a Christian as well. In Luke chapter 14 and verse 27, Luke chapter 14 and verse 27 says, "And whosoever doth not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." You know, it seems Jason was willing to do that. He knew that there was potential danger in helping these guys, and you know, he didn't hesitate to do that. In 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 12, 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 12 says, "Yea, and all that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution." You know, as we read some of these stories, we can see definitely the persecution that they were dealing with, and it may not be the same for us today, but we have some things that we'll have to deal with that aren't maybe comfortable, but honestly, we've got it pretty good. And, you know, sometimes it's sad to think about, look at what these guys were willing to do, and I'm not willing to do some small thing where I'm not really going to be persecuted hardly at all. And yet it makes us hesitate even today if somebody's going to make fun of us. I mean, these guys back there that were putting their lives on the line, I'm afraid what they would think of us if, you know, we're afraid to speak up and bring the message of Christ to others. So he was willing to do that and pay that price, and we need to be willing to no matter what persecution comes today, or maybe it's different in the future here. You know, there's other parts of the world that do face true persecution and a fear of openly following Christ. And so there's people that deal with much more than we do. And yet Jason was courageous. You know, despite the danger, despite, you know, possibly being in harm's way, you know, there's no part of the story that says he denied that he knew them. There's no part that said, no, they weren't staying with me, or no, I don't know who Christ is. He didn't do any of that from what we can tell in this story. He was courageous and faced the authorities and did what he needed to do in that case. And so he was courageous as we can tell from this story. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 10, Matthew chapter 5 and verse 10, a couple more verses here. It says, "Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And then in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 16, 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 16, there says, "Yet if any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God on this behalf." And so, again, Jason was willing to step out and to be courageous, to pay the price, and maybe a minor character, but we can all play our part. You know, so in conclusion, you know, if we look at Jason and look at what he did, may have seemed like a small deal, but he opened up his home. He was willing to show hospitality to those that are around us, and we can do that in various ways, and sometimes that can open up opportunities for us to share the gospel and share Christ's message to others. And it may not be exactly the same way that he did here and letting these people stay with him, but it may open up doors for us as well. Of course, we need to have courage to stand up for the faith, to be willing, no matter what the challenges are, to stand up for the gospel and share the gospel with others. It's certainly worth the risk. If you think about how they thought about it, it was worth the risk to share the gospel despite the persecution, despite the chances that they would be put to death. The gospel to them was important, and it was worth putting themselves out there and putting themselves at risk. And so we need to have courage, perhaps more than we do sometimes, to be able to do that. And then he supported the work. You know, he supported the work, did what he could do, right? And in his case, he was willing to, you know, have people come and stay with them. Like I say, all of us can support the work in some way, and it doesn't have to look the same way. But let's look for ways that we can help. It may seem small, but as you can see, someone that did this made a huge difference and enabled Paul and Silas to continue to do the important work that they were doing and spread the gospel and help people hear that and turn to Christ and obey it. And so hopefully we're encouraged by the story here. Hopefully some things we can think about and use in our life to have the kind of faith that he had and the commitment to Christ, and help others hear about God's word and what Christ has done for us. So hopefully this is helpful to you. We never know the minds of those that are here. There may be one that would like to obey the gospel and be added to his kingdom. We certainly invite you to do that tonight. Or if there's one that needs the prayers of the church for any reason, we invite you to come and have a seat on the front pew as we stand and sing the song of invitation.